How do I tell the difference between coping and self-care? Because sometimes they're the very same activities. Working out for some people, for instance, leaves them very refreshed and energized. And yet there are other people who spend 4 or 5 hours a day at a health center working out. And one would have to ask, are there a lot of things that are not happening in your life to be able to spend that kind of time here? The same might be for reading. You know, some of us read for great pleasure and information and relaxation, and other people read to escape. How are you using the behavior that you're choosing? Do you feel refreshed by it? Do you feel re-energized? Do you feel like your life is better because of having done what you've done? Or are you still feeling gloomy and you've escaped something for a time and then it just returns again without really much resolution? Usually you can tell by the peace and calm that you feel afterwards which one it is.
Right.
Welcome to the Faithful and True podcast. We're here today with, again, our director of Faithful and True, Debbie.
What am I
what are you
What
again?
am I directing?
She's an LMFT. She's the director. She's the co-founder, and we're thrilled to have Debbie Laaser with us today. And as usual, we've convinced our host, Greg Miller, to join us again. And we're excited to be back with you as we're going to continue the conversation that we started on the last podcast about coping strategies.
Right. And so for those who maybe haven't had a chance to listen to the last one that we did on coping, we want to just clarify that here at Faithful and True, when we're talking about coping, we're talking about those behaviors or those experiences that take us out of reality. They remove us from relationships. And so at Faithful and True, when we talk about coping, we see it as a negative thing. We don't see it as a good thing. And the alternative, the healthy thing, is self-care. And so for those of you, some of you may be seeing a therapist or in a community where they talk about healthy coping. Well, here we would say healthy coping is self-care. And when we talk about coping, we're going to be talking about those things that keep us from being present in our own lives.
And we're using them primarily to comfort ourselves. So that's why we step out of relationships, because what's most important in that moment is, am I being taken care of? And so our choices are often on our own without other people, and we're doing what we need to do just to make our lives more manageable from painful situations.
I often talk about the scripture, the Beatitudes. One of them is, blessed are they that mourn, for they shall be comforted. And the foundation of that scripture is, in order for there to be comfort, there has to be mourning. There has to be grief. There has to be pain. We have to be willing to feel that, and then there can be comfort. Well, coping, addiction, that is an attempt to experience comfort without having to experience the mourning. And so what we're wanting to do is to recognize that sometimes life is difficult, it is painful, it is uncomfortable. And if we can be present in that with ourselves and present with God and present with others, that's where we experience comfort. But anytime we're trying to escape the mourning, we're not going to be able to experience the comfort that's been promised.
I think one of the questions that we get often when we're talking at the workshop or with our clients is, how do I tell the difference between coping and self-care? Because sometimes they're the very same activities. Working out for some people, for instance, leaves them very refreshed and energized. And yet there are other people who spend 4 or 5 hours a day at a health center working out. And one would have to ask, are there a lot of things that are not happening in your life to be able to spend that kind of time here? The same might be for reading. You know, some of us read for great pleasure and information and relaxation, and other people read to escape. And so I think one of the questions that we would want to ask ourselves, or you can as a listener, is, how are you using the behavior that you're choosing? Do you feel refreshed by it? Do you feel re-energized? Do you feel like your life is better because of having done what you've done? Or are you still feeling gloomy and you've escaped something for a time and then it just returns again without really much resolution? usually you can tell by the peace and calm that you feel afterwards which one it is.
Right. And I do think the amount of time I spend doing something can be an indicator, not always, but like you used in the health club example, if I'm there a significant amount of time, one of the things that we talk about at the men's workshop for a lot of men, golfing is something that they're interested in. And so if I spend a significant amount of time golfing, it's what I do every weekend, and it takes me away from being with my family and connecting with others, then that's something I need to pay attention to. And, using our imagery, it's not what we're doing, it's what part of us are doing it. Is this coming from our wise adult, or is this coming from our survivor? And one of the things that's really complicated is something can be really good, like participating in the community of faith, going to church, nurturing your relationship in that way. But it's not, am I going to church? It's what part of me is going to church. Is the wise adult part of me going, and I'm present with myself, I'm authentic, I'm honest, I'm connected to good community, and I'm known there? Or do I go to church and it's more about my image, it's more about performance, it's more about obligation? If something is about obligation, then rarely is it coming out of that wise adult part of us. So if I'm doing something because I feel like I have to do it and I don't have a choice, then that's going to lead to resentment and bitterness. And if I'm feeling resentment and bitterness, then more than likely it wasn't self-care.
I think it's always a great question to ask ourselves when we make a decision to do something. What is our motive? What is my motivation? And that often speaks to, is this congruent with my values, or is this just, again, escaping something difficult, or I don't want to meet with that person, so I'm not going to answer the phone. I'm going to tell them that I was busy working or lie or something. So our motivation is really an important thing to check out on a regular basis to make sure that we're being authentic with our values.
Right. And a great irony is recovery can become a coping strategy. Recovery can actually not be helpful if I'm doing it out of that place of performance. So if I'm in my wise adult and I'm moving towards my recovery and my plan in an honest, authentic way, I'm showing up in a transparent way in my communities and in my relationships, then that can be transformative. But if I'm in that survivor place where I'm performing it, I'm creating an image, I'm just checking the boxes, as we say around here, then that's not really going to be transformative, and I'm using a recovery plan as a way to cope. And what's interesting is many times the people around us, our spouses, our family, our community, can feel that difference of when is it authentic recovery and when is somebody doing it simply as a coping strategy or out of obligation or to avoid somebody else's disappointment.
I think what's interesting when we're in a marriage, how oftentimes we end up having arguments with each other about how each other is coping, because we notice that this person is doing so much of that, or she's doing way too much spending, in my opinion, or whatever. So I think that's one of the things that could awaken us to take a look at what we are doing. And again, what's the motivation? And is it true that we're missing out on important elements of our life because we're spending way too much time avoiding something else?
Well, and you mentioned in our last podcast the role of technology and screens, and that being aware of how much time I'm on this and what am I wanting to do with this, and am I doing the screen, I'm actually like holding it, am I doing the screen in a way that it keeps me from engaging in whatever else is going on? And so, it may be about how much time I'm on the screen. It may be about when I choose to look at it. I just have an argument with somebody and I rush to my screen to see what was going on, or am I feeling lonely? So I'm wanting to go to my social media to feel connected. But it's, again, not just what I'm doing, but how I'm doing it and why I'm doing it.
I often say that, if someone is irritated with me or you or anyone else, or frustrated or angry about something we're doing, it's not a bad idea. If you're willing to do this, it's kind of advanced growth, I think, is to say, well, is there a part of that that's true? Is there a part of that maybe I do want to look at? Because people who are closest to me are obviously annoyed by something, and they may be onto something here, and they want what's best for me. Granted, it comes out of a place of frustration for them. And I think that's oftentimes how we grow when we're able to look at something someone who loves us is irritated by and say, you might be right about that. I want to take a look at that.
Well, and so that brings us to one of our coping strategies that we learn early on is defensiveness. That if I perceive I'm being attacked, if somebody's coming at me, whether it's real or not, if I perceive it, then my defenses go up in that protective place, and I'm unable to hear what somebody else is wanting to say to me, or maybe to hear what somebody is seeing in me, because I feel like I have to defend myself. And I can tell you, and if Beth was here, she would tell you, defending is one of the things that I struggle with. It's one of my coping strategies, and I've spent a lot of time talking to my therapist about it and trying to figure it out. And I think that part of it is growing up, I was overly responsible. I took on things that were not something a child should take on. I was given things that probably, I know a child should not be given. And I think that there's this part of me that even as an adult now lives in fear that somebody's going to give me that's not mine, that I'm going to be blamed for something that's not mine. And so my first reaction when somebody's challenging me or encouraging me to look at something is to get defensive and just declare first, that's not mine. And I know that that's a barrier in my relationships. Instead of kind of what you're talking about, to try my best to be open. Is there something in what they're saying that rings true for me that I can take on? So, for those of us who are defensive, recognizing that defensiveness is an attempt to create safety when we perceive that there's an attack. And that perception word is so important. Just because I perceive that somebody's coming after me or attacking me doesn't mean that they are. That's just the way that I'm experiencing it.
And I know it's not our topic for today, Greg, but it also can be true that you are being attacked, or someone is using too much criticism or blaming, or all or never statements, or whatever it is. And so we do drop into defensiveness because we are in fact not being safe emotionally with each other. So just on your behalf, I just want to say
you're always doing that.
What other behaviors do we notice? Do people kind of claim when they're working on this coping stuff? We usually put a big list on the board at our workshops, at least at the women's workshop.
Well, one of the ones that I think can ring true for a lot of people, especially since our audience typically is someone in a faith community, and that is self-righteousness. That self-righteousness is one of those coping strategies that keep us from looking at our own stories and our own experiences. And at the men's workshop, we talk about this. And the way I say you can identify self-righteousness when you're creating a long list of all the things you haven't done, and you're not taking responsibility for the things that you have done. And again, there's this fear that what I've done is too much, that grace is not going to be enough for me. Even an old works belief of if I'm good enough, then maybe I can earn grace or God will love me. And so just paying attention, do I find myself being judgmental and critical of others, and is it coming out of a self-righteous place? Well, that self-righteousness is a protection strategy and can be a coping strategy.
I think of more simple things like sleep. I think a lot of people use sleep. I know that works for me too. When I'm really hurting, I can actually go to sleep. Other people say, how do you do that? I'm like, I don't know, but it works for me. I think emotional eating is another thing many people do, to try to just block out pain in life or an uncomfortable situation, stress at work, whatever it is. And it's so tempting. I have my comfort foods. I know what they are.
Right.
When I'm having a bad day, and if I'm not choosing something healthier, I go right for those.
Right.
And again, they're not killing people. I have probably better choices, but once in a while, they're very nice.
Right.
But I love to eat and I love to sleep. Next. What's next?
Next.
Well, I think one that is really current is sports.
Yeah.
That and it can
For the trifecta.
it can be the wide range. I know that for a lot of families, the over focus on their children's sports can be a coping strategy where it gives us the topic for us to talk about. It's the thing that we organize around. It creates this sense of connection because we're all going to the games together. We're processing the games together. And so it can be, our youth sports, but it can also be our loyalty to college teams or professional teams where we get to be a part of something. We gather as a family. We're yelling for the same team. And again, it's that sense that we are connected, but we're not really connected to each other. We're connected to this experience on the TV. I think projects fits in that category. A lot of people, they gather to do a project together. And instead of really connecting to each other, they're connected to the project, which creates this sense of connection. And so that can fit into the workaholism, overworking. And what I'm aware of for myself and working with others who struggle with work addiction, it's not the amount that I work, it's not how much I enjoy my work, it's am I working in order to be rescued from something? Am I wanting to get my value, my identity, and my safety from my work? That then leans into the work addiction.
Of course, all addictions fall into coping strategies. And in some ways, I think when we're around people with different addiction issues that they're trying to recover from, it helps us to have more empathy, I think, and understanding about which one we're working on. Mark and I had the great experience of being part of the Recovering Couples Anonymous 12-step program. And in there, we had people who struggled with all kinds of addictions. And I have to say, it was so healing to realize that the other issues that were brought into the 12-step meetings were all the same, regardless of whether we were with a drug addict or someone recovering from alcohol or sex addiction or food addiction, whatever it was. And there was something really deeply healing for me to understand how much alike we were, and yet some of the coping that was chosen was different.
Right.
And I think that is one of the ways when we get further away from our own pain about sex addiction, by the way, because we know it's very painful. We become better allies, I think, when we understand why people use coping. Again, that it's not for the purpose of hurting us so much as it is about taking care of themselves. And when we can begin to understand that, I think we have a lot more acceptance of other people and their quirky things they're doing, which typically would annoy us, but we understand more about what it's doing for them.
Right. Well, and you mentioned that one of the most meaningful groups I was ever a part of was an open group where any addiction, men and women could gather. It was sponsored by a counseling center that I was a part of. And very much what you were talking about, there was the word that I would use, it's so clarifying. I could see myself more clearly as the others were talking about whatever it was that they were struggling with. And it might not be my struggle, but I could see myself more clearly as they were talking about it. And again, one of the things, if we think of this as a continuum, and one end of the continuum is coping and the other end of the continuum is addiction. Many of our listeners would rightly say they don't have an addiction, that they've leaned more into that coping strategy. It is helpful, though, to be able to recognize I'm on the same continuum. I may not be at that 5 that would be classified as an addiction, but I do know what it is to use a behavior or a substance to temporarily escape from my reality. And the consequences may be less. One of the messages of self-righteousness is, well, at least I didn't, fill in the blank. And that puts us in that oppositional place with someone that we may care about. It may be helpful to say, I didn't do that, and I have the capacity to do that. When we acknowledge, and this is one of the things that we teach at the workshop, one of the principles of recovery is don't compare, identify. And so instead of comparing who's acting out as the worst or whose coping strategy is the worst or who's further on the continuum, just to be able to recognize I can identify with everyone who seeks to escape at some point because reality is difficult or painful. And I know what it's to do that. It may look different for me, but if we can do that identification piece, that's where we can create empathy and connection.
I had a really interesting conversation with one of my clients yesterday, and she's fairly early on in the discovery of her husband's addiction, and she's been in a lot of pain and has a lot of anger. She spent a few days away, however, with a good mentor friend. And she said they had just some of the best conversations. And the friend was asking her a lot about how she was coping with all this anger, and which might be our segue to how we use emotions for this. I loved what she said to me, though, which was, one of the things I really learned being away this weekend is how much I was starting to hate myself for how I was responding to this pain in my life, in that I clearly learned I have the capacity to be this mean, and I never thought I did. And she said in some kind of unusual ways, it helped me connect with my husband, realizing we all have the capacity to do some outrageous things in our life, depending on how painful it gets. And so I thought for someone pretty early on in the process, that was really a very deep thought of hers.
Absolutely.
Herself.
And like you said, that is a great transition, because one of the things that we want to acknowledge is that we can also use emotions as a way to create safety and emotions as a way to cope. And in this particular case, you were talking about anger. And, what we want people to know is there's nothing wrong with being angry. Anger is a legitimate reaction. It's part of who God created us to be. And for a lot of our listeners, they may have actually grew up in an environment where anger was seen as a sin, or healthy anger wasn't modeled. So they really don't have access to their anger. But what's also can be true is for some people, anger is the way that they create safety when they feel threatened. We also know that when somebody's shame gets triggered, they can use anger to push people away. But if we think about it, if I feel threatened, then what I do is I try to get big, I try to get loud, and in my bigness and my loudness, I'm trying to create safety. So this idea of, is this anger in me coming from a healthy, wise adult who has every right to be angry and is expressing it in clean ways? Or is it this survivor part of me where the anger is messy and destructive and is creating chaos for me? Kind of like what your client said, I don't like who I have become in this, and paying attention to the role that anger has. There was a phrase or a word that was coined, rageaholic, kind of recognizing that we can use our rage in this addictive way too. And it's always, I think, about trying to create safety.
I'm just really sad I didn't bring my porcupine down with me. And I have my porcupine up in my office. But I have him to recommend, and it's not maybe a him, it could be a her. I have my porcupine to represent what we become, like when our anger is being used as a coping mechanism. And it sabotages oftentimes what we really want, which is to be heard and understood, or to grow closer to someone. But with those quills coming out of there and whatever, no one's going to want to come close to us. So we do create space, and we eliminate the idea, again, of healthy relationship when our anger comes out. So if we don't learn how to express it with some regulation, unfortunately, it's going to work against us, eventually. And that's why it's so important to learn how to regulate a very natural emotion. We're earthlings, let's face it. And there are a lot of things that are angering on this earth.
Right.
So it will be good to figure out how to not be a pain when we're in pain, as Maya Angelou says.
It's kind of the scripture, be angry, just don't sin in your anger. There's actually an invitation to be angry. And one time I heard a sermon about that particular passage, and implied in the passage is there are times it is a sin not to be angry. There are some things that we should be angry about, and it's important that we have access and can steward our anger. I think another emotion that could be a part of a coping strategy is confusion. In my therapy group one time, one of the women that were there, I had a co-ed therapy group, said, well, I don't know what to do. And the therapist said to her, well, actually, I think your confusion is a coping strategy, because if you don't know what to do, then you don't have to do anything. And it was one of those things where if he had said that to me, I might not have taken it in, but observing it, I go, oh, wow, that is probably so true for me, that there are times where we say we're confused, we act confused, we behave confused, But the reality is we have more clarity about what needs to be done, and we're just resistant to doing it, or we're afraid of the consequences of doing it. And it does take courage to move. It's that idea that whatever is the next right step, and may we have the courage and the capacity to choose that step. But I once heard somebody ask the question, if you weren't confused, what might be a good next choice? And so if we can get the confusion out of the way, then maybe we can see what the next choice might be.
I think we all have been there,
Yes.
haven't we, with that statement?
Well, we have just enough time if you'd like to kind of sum this up. Give us a closing thought that you'd like to share with our audience.
Well, what I would like to share is coping is a natural part of all of us to have in our life at times, to take care of life when it's hard, and it is hard, and we will have trouble, and there will be times that are so difficult. We need to choose something to help us with that. Ideally, we're looking for things that are less and less damaging, and we're in less and less time, so that we're moving more towards that self-care. What would be a healthier choice for me? I think it's one of the ways to accept other people, because when we're in our coping environment, our survivor chair, as we say, we don't look pretty usually. And people are saying, oh, that just doesn't match with the person I know. We're not our authentic self when we're there. And so if we understand that we all go there at times, we all do these things, perhaps we have a greater empathy for people and accept the fact they're not perfect and they're working on things as well. But our emotional growth is going to be dependent a lot on our identifying for ourselves what I do and how do I want to change that so that I'm putting in healthier choices for my life. It will lead to more authenticity for me and greater relationships with others.
Do you see why we invite her on?
Yeah.
Yeah. Very good.
One thing I would say is if you're curious, and we are big fans of curiosity, that maybe you do have a coping strategy, whether it's a behavior or an emotion, one of the ways to evaluate it is to ask, is this a prominent part of my life? Is it something that I'm experiencing or doing regularly? And in the doing of it, is it limiting my ability to engage other people? Does this move me towards people, or does this move me away from people? And if you're beginning to realize that there's some pretty consistent patterns in your life, whether it's a behavior or an emotion, and it's limiting your ability to connect, you might be open to the possibility that it's a coping strategy. If you have a safe person in your life that knows you well, and it feels safe to ask, hey, is there something that you see in me? Because many times our community can see something before we can see it. And that can be another way to experience it and to understand it. But again, self-care is going to move us towards God and towards ourselves and towards others. Coping is actually going to move us away from God, move us away from others, and move us away from ourselves.
So just so you know, I'm not open to how I'm coping, okay, guys? Even though you're my community, I'm too tired today.
Don't want to have that conversation.
We know her well. She needs sleep and food quickly. Well, thank you both, Debbie and Greg. This has been a fascinating subject that we've been talking about today. We hope that our audience has appreciated it as well. I've been very pleased and moved by the number of people that are attributing their, because it's a question that we ask on the registration for the workshops. And there have been so many that are crediting listening to the podcast as why they're coming. So we'd like to make that invitation to you, that you would reach out to faithfulandtrue.com if you're looking for the kind of help that we're offering here, and visit faithfulandtrue.com, where you'll find all the resources. You'll find over 400 podcasts like this one, as well as our bookstore with all the books by Mark and Debbie Laaser, and all of the online information and registration available for our 3-day intensive workshops. So check out faithfulandtrue.com and give us a call if there's any questions that you might have. Until then, we hope that this coming week for you will be filled with many blessings and with great vision.